If you want a symbol of the most divisive issue in Australian politics today, then look no further than this immigration detention centre in suburban Sydney. Because behind the fence and the locked gates are people who entered Australia illegally to seek asylum. And across this country there are thousands of people being held in centres like this as their asylum claims are being processed. Now, journalists are not allowed access to this centre or any of the others, but what is happening to asylum seekers raises serious questions about Australia's sense of itself and its future. Desperate people run enormous risks to get to Australia. 4 months ago, a boat carrying close to 100 would-be immigrants, men, women and children, was smashed into rocks on Christmas Island off Australia's northwest coast. More than 30 people lost their lives as islanders watched, helpless. These images horrified Australians. They were confronted with human suffering many would prefer to ignore. Australia does not want these boat people. Those who survived the disaster were detained on Christmas Island, inside this sprawling detention centre. Their claims for asylum are being processed. It could take months, even years. In February, some of the shipwreck survivors were escorted from Christmas Island to Sydney, just for a couple of days, to attend the funerals of their family members who perished at sea. Among the dead, men, women and children whose journeys began in Iran and ended in this suburban cemetery. One of the mourners was Hussein Husseini. He survived the shipwreck, but his wife and baby son were drowned. While in Sydney, the Christmas Island shipwreck survivors were held in Villawood Detention Centre. Journalists aren't allowed in, but one visitor surreptitiously filmed an interview with Hussein before he was transported back to Christmas Island.
همه اعصابا داغون، واقعا اعصابا همه خرابن. نمیخوام واقعا برگردیم. نمیخوام واقعا برگردیم. فامیل داریم اینجا. هر چقدر آدم بیشتر بتونه دور بر فامیل آشناش باشه، فراموش میکنه مسئله رو. خورده کمتر فکر میکنه. درسته این مسئله فراموش نشدنیه، واقعا نمیتونه، ولی خب کمتر میتونید فکر کنیم. خدا شده شبایش که اصلا خواب نداره. همه صحنه جلو چشامونه.
My children put the flower, they tell me, Tina's tell me, Mom, that's the Hussein and Maryam, and this one the baby.
Maisa Al-Jadri was Hussein's closest childhood friend, and she mourns the loss of his wife and child.
Thinking like she's not Iranian.
Maisa lives in Sydney, a new Australian citizen who arrived with a previous wave of boat people. She's now desperate to help Hussein win asylum.
He doesn't have anything now. His child gone, his wife gone, his heart gone. We must understand. When you lost your love, how you feeling? Especially when you put baby in the funeral. That's his first child. And he talking about his child.
What is your message to the Australian government, to the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen?
Just I want to say to Minister, I thank you for everything you do for us. I know a lot of things you did it very good for us. And I know you have result for what you doing. Maybe we can understand that because you minister and you have big country, you must look after all the problem of this country. I understand that. But I just want to say, if you bring them to Sydney with us, that's little things for you. You must help them. These people coming for nice future. Don't keep them in Christmas Island. Christmas Island and detention center, not nice place for them. These people coming to free country, free life. Don't keep them on Christmas Island.
Immigration has become a political battleground in Australia. Never mind their relatively small numbers, the boat people are in the middle of it. The last Conservative government was hard-line. Refugee boats were intercepted and turned away by the Navy. A policy dropped by the current Labour administration. It has become a defining policy difference. There's an irony here. The Australia currently preoccupied with the threat of illegal immigration is a country built by generations of immigrants. The mix of people on the streets of Sydney's western suburbs tells the story. Vietnamese immigrants rub shoulders with Afghans, Lebanese, Iranians and Iraqis. Business leaders say immigrants are vital to the country's continued economic growth. 160,000 were welcomed last year. The vast majority were given entry as skilled workers or students. Those who come as refugees are supposed to go through a screening process. Unauthorised immigrants, boat people, are seen by many Aussies as queue jumpers, and that is where the anger kicks in.
On Sydney's 2UE. Now, David Oldfield, live.
13:32 is the number, 6 minutes past 11 on 2UE morning program with David Oldfield.
Tune in to Sydney's talk radio stations and you hear plenty of Australians convinced that immigration now poses a threat to their culture and values.
So in that, I welcome to the program Steve Sacker, who is the journalist and presenter of HARDtalk, a current affairs interview program on BBC World News. Thanks for joining us and thank you for choosing our program.
And David, it's a real pleasure to be here. Here's the thing. To me, there is a very interesting sort of paradox that a country built by immigrants is now so divided and polarised on the issue of further immigration. And for the next hour, I got an earful of strong opinions.
George?
Yeah, I think the problem basically comes about because we've got a disproportionate amount of people who don't want to integrate, and obviously I'm referring particularly to the fundamentalist Muslims.
Cameron, hi, go ahead.
I had to drive out to Lakembia, so I got to tell you, I was surprised. I felt like a foreigner in my own country. These women that wear just slits for their eyes, I mean, that's barbaric tribalism that goes back thousands of years. That's not in touch with the modern world.
Paul, hi.
I'm quite sure if somebody did some investigations and asked the Australian people, not whether you were born here, but the actual Australian people, if they wanted the amount of immigration to keep going the way it is, it would be firmly against.
Mohammed.
Yeah, mate. If you want people to be part of this country, you've got to make them feel part of this country. And people like you...
What, yourself included, Mohammed?
A delusionary person, mate. That you target minority communities is absolutely ridiculous.
So, is radio host David Oldfield simply deepening divisions within Australian society? Why is it that so many people in your audience seem so full of fear and or anger when it comes to immigration?
Well, they've had a lot of what they see as inappropriate immigration in all its forms. Multiculturalism, the supposed situation of those seeking asylum, sometimes real, sometimes not. They've pretty much had that jammed down their throat for a number of decades now. A lot of Australians say, look, we didn't ask for multiculturalism, it was just forced upon us as a policy. In fact, there's been many who have called for a referendum to find out whether such should continue.
But hang on, that's not true, is it? I mean, multiculturalism was a cross-party consensus for years in Australia. It's a democratic country. That's what people voted for.
Well, no. I mean, after it was introduced by a single party, which, by the way, was wiped out in the biggest federal landslide in the nation's history back in 1975. But
it was consensus. For a long time, it has been a consensus in Australia that multiculturalism makes sense to make Australia work.
By the political parties, not by the people themselves. And that's been clear in every poll that's been taken in the last 30 years whenever the issue of immigration comes up.
So you're saying, across the parties, the politicians of Australia have let the country down? Is that what you're saying?
Certainly on this issue, very much so.
It should be said for our audience that you speak from the point of view of a very small minority. You were for a time in the New South Wales Parliament a representative of One Nation. Now, One Nation was a very extreme party in Australian terms, and it never succeeded in making a national breakthrough.
Well, it's extreme in your view. I haven't had anything to do with the organisation for over 10 years, and once again, I still don't step back from having been a member. This is not a One Nation issue. Now, people try and make it into a One Nation issue. It is an issue of people being upset with what they see as inappropriate immigration practices. And regardless of what the political parties will say, there has been a great deal of concern for this amongst large numbers of Australians, and that can be seen in all of the polls that have been taken over many decades.
Most of the callers we heard today were deeply concerned about immigration, but particularly about Muslim immigration. We had a couple of callers who were self-identified Muslims, whose message was very clear. They said, we are Aussies, we're proud to be Aussies, it may take Muslims time to integrate into this country fully, just as it's taken other ethnic groupings time to integrate fully into this country, but give us time. Is your mind closed, or when you hear those calls, do you reflect and consider that maybe they're right?
No, I'm hopeful that they are right. Unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they're not right. They may be speaking for themselves and for other Muslims that are decent, law-abiding Australians that do feel that way, and I'm hopeful that is the case, because for us to be a cohesive society, that is exactly the sorts of views, but not just views, the actions that we need to back up those views to take place.
A final thought. If one looks at the demographics of Australia and the continued lawful immigration into Australia, there is no doubt that over time Australia is going to become less white and less Christian. Do you have a problem with that?
Not as long as we have a society that is cohesive, which I don't believe we have currently. It's breaking down rather than uniting, and not as long as people are law-abiding and they adopt that which we see generally as being the Australian culture.
Well, that's a way of saying, yes, I do have a problem with that. Why not be honest about it? You have a problem with it.
I'm not being dishonest. I have a problem with multiculturalism.
I've never been back for it. A much simpler, direct question. Yeah. Do you have a problem with Australia becoming less white and less Christian?
No.
David Oldfield, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Pleasure.